On the surface, it looked like a miracle. In the early 1950s, the narrative was flawless. The Danish state projected an image of benevolence to the world. They pointed to the new concrete blocks rising from the ice as monuments to progress. They showcased modern tuberculosis wards and heated radiators as gifts of civilization. In the halls of the United Nations, Danish statesmen smiled for the cameras, proudly declaring the end of colonial rule. They claimed they were welcoming the Inuit into the fold as equals, brothers in a new constitutional Denmark. But peel back the concrete facade, and you find a different reality. This was not an evolution. It was an eviction. A society of autonomous hunters who had mastered the harshest environment on Earth for millennia was suddenly uprooted. They were concentrated into administrative centers, cramped, urbanized settlements designed for efficiency, not humanity. Here lies the central paradox. As the electric lights turned on, the spirit of a people began to dim. The statistics tell a haunting story. As the infrastructure modernized, the human cost skyrocketed. In these new concrete boxes, stripped of their purpose and severed from the land, the hunters found a new enemy they could not spear. Alcoholism surged. The suicide rate began a tragic, vertical climb, rising in exact proportion to the number of modern amenities installed. Why did this happen? Why the sudden, desperate rush to civilize the Arctic? We must look past the lie of benevolence. The 1953 integration was not a gift of equality. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a constitutional amendment. The Cold War was freezing over. The United States needed the Thule Air Base to watch the Soviet Union, and Denmark needed to secure its seat at the NATO table. To keep the island, Denmark had to prove to the UN that Greenland was no longer a colony, but an integral part of the kingdom. Denmark bought permanent sovereignty over the Arctic, but the currency they used to pay for it was the cultural castration of the Inuit people. To understand the tragedy of 1953, we must leave the ice for a moment and travel to the smoke-filled offices of Copenhagen in the late 1940s. The Second World War had ended, but for the Danish government, the sense of siege had not lifted. It had merely changed shape. Denmark stood as a small, fragile nation, battered by the war and squeezed between two rising titans. They were the anxious owner. They held the title deed to the world's largest island, but they were terrified they didn't actually possess it. The first source of this existential fear was the United States. During the Nazi occupation of Europe, Denmark had lost contact with Greenland. For 5 years, the United States had stepped in as the protector. They built bases, they supplied the Inuit, and they established a strategic footprint that they had no intention of abandoning. The Americans had the guns, the money, and the strategic necessity. Denmark knew that if push came to shove, Washington could simply offer to buy the island, as they had tried before, or worse, simply take it. Copenhagen realized that traditional colonialism was dead. They couldn't hold Greenland by force against a superpower. But there was a second threat, one made of paper and ink, which was perhaps even more dangerous than the American military, the United Nations. The New World Order had a specific weapon against old empires, Article 73 of the UN Charter. This article was a bureaucratic nightmare for Denmark. It demanded that all colonial powers report annually on the progress of their non-self-governing territories. It meant international inspections. It meant that the world was watching. It meant a countdown clock to independence. Denmark was trapped. If they kept Greenland as a colony, the UN would eventually force them to let it go. If they let it go, the Americans would swallow it whole, and Denmark would lose its only claim to geopolitical relevance. So the strategists in Copenhagen devised a masterstroke, a way to checkmate both the US and the UN in a single move. The solution was not to change the reality on the ground, but to change the definition of the territory. If Greenland was no longer a colony, Article 73 would not apply. The UN inspectors would have no jurisdiction. And if Greenland was constitutionally integrated, made an inseparable part of the Danish realm, the United States could not buy it any more than they could buy Jutland or Copenhagen. The plan was simple: convert Greenland from a subject colony into a domestic amt, a county. It was a brilliant legal fiction. It solved Denmark's existential crisis. It secured their borders and silenced the UN critics. But in their desperation to save their national pride and geopolitical status, they forgot one variable in the equation. They forgot to ask the people living on the ice if they wanted to become a county in Europe. If the integration was a robbery, the 1953 Constitution was the getaway car. But to understand the heist, we must look at the currency. Denmark did not simply keep Greenland, they traded it. In the high-stakes poker game of the Cold War, Greenland was Denmark's buy-in. Without this massive island, Denmark was merely a small, vulnerable coastal nation on the Baltic Sea. But with Greenland, they were the gatekeepers of the Arctic. They controlled the early warning systems. They held the keys to the north. Greenland was the ultimate membership fee for NATO security. To legalize this exchange, Copenhagen needed a signature, but they didn't ask the people. There was no referendum on the ice. Instead, the process was funneled through the Landsrådet, a local council guided by Danish officials. The approval was engineered. The yes was assumed. And the 1953 Constitution was ratified. With the legal paperwork filed, the real work, the social engineering, began. The Danish state viewed the Inuit way of life not as a culture to be preserved, but as a logistical error to be corrected. They introduced the G50 and later G60 policies, a master plan of centralization. To the technocrats in Copenhagen, a hunter living in a remote settlement was inefficient. He was hard to tax, hard to educate, and hard to control. So they began the Great Concentration. They traded the freedom of the sled for the confinement of the trawler. They swapped self-sufficient turf huts for numbered concrete boxes. Thousands were moved from their ancestral settlements into urban centers like Nuuk. It was a transaction of convenience. Denmark gained administrative ease, but the Inuit lost their connection to the land that defined their souls. But the cruelest mechanism was written directly into the payroll. Denmark introduced the birthplace criterion, Fødestedskriteriet. It was a policy of economic apartheid. If you were born in Denmark, you were paid a premium. If you were born in Greenland, doing the exact same job, you were paid a fraction of the wage. It was a predatory contract. It told the Inuit that even in this new equal kingdom, they were second-class citizens. It drained the ambition from a generation, creating a permanent underclass in their own home. Denmark had secured its place in NATO, but it had done so by mortgaging the future of the Greenlandic people. Once the legal framework was set, Denmark began to rewire the physical reality of the island. They called it modernization, but in practice it was a forced centralization. The planners in Copenhagen looked at the map and saw inefficiency. The small settlements, the bygder, where families had lived in rhythm with the seasons for generations, were deemed unprofitable. So they shut them down. The logic was cold and mathematical. It was cheaper to heat one massive apartment block in Nuuk or Sisimiut than to supply 50 remote villages. Thousands were funneled into these growing urban centers. But in doing so, Denmark shattered the natural social safety net of the tribes. In the village, no one starved because the catch was shared. In the concrete blocks of the city, isolation set in. The community was replaced by the neighbor you didn't know. But the walls weren't just made of concrete, they were made of language. To control the narrative, you must control the tongue. Danish became the exclusive language of power, administration, and opportunity. If you wanted to speak to a doctor, argue a legal case, or pass an exam, you had to do it in Danish. Greenlandic, the language of the land, was relegated to second-class status. A generation of intelligent, capable people were suddenly rendered illiterate in their own country. They were silenced not by force, but by bureaucracy. The message was clear. To advance, you must become Danish. To remain Inuit was to remain behind. This created the internal weakness, a psychological trap designed to neutralize resistance. The new school system taught Inuit children a curriculum of shame. They learned that their culture was a relic, a museum piece, while Danish culture was the future. When you break a people's pride, you break their political will. It is hard to fight for independence when you have been trained to believe you are incapable of it. Finally, the trap was sealed with gold. The self-sufficient economy of the hunter was dismantled and replaced by the allowance economy. Copenhagen began pouring subsidies into the island. On paper, it looked like aid. In reality, it was an addictive drug. Greenland transformed from a society of independent survivors, poor in material, but rich in autonomy, into a nation of permanent debtors. The welfare state became the ultimate leash. You do not bite the hand that feeds you, even if that hand has just locked the cage. If the relocation was a tragedy, what followed was a violation. By the mid-1960s, the modernization of Greenland was becoming expensive. The population was growing, and with it, the cost of the Danish welfare state. The technocrats in Copenhagen looked at the birth rates and saw a budget deficit. They decided to cut the cost by cutting the future. This was the Coil Campaign, a covert operation that lasted for years. Danish doctors inserted intrauterine devices, IUDs, into thousands of Inuit women. Many were not asked. Some were as young as 13. They went to the doctor for a sore throat or a checkup and left sterilized, often without their parents' knowledge. This was the tipping point. It revealed the dark heart of the administration. They were no longer governing citizens. They were managing a herd. They applied the logic of livestock control to human beings, prioritizing the national budget over the sanctity of the female body. But while the women were being physically violated, the men were being psychologically dismantled. This triggered a total social cascade. We call it role dispossession. Out on the ice, a hunter is a provider. He is a master of his environment, a pillar of his community. But moved into a concrete township, stripped of his dogs and his purpose, he became something else, unemployed. The skills that had sustained his people for 4,000 years, reading the ice, tracking the seal, were rendered worthless by the industrial trawler and the supermarket. The system didn't just take his job, it took his dignity. When you strip a human being of their purpose, you create a vacuum. And in Greenland, that vacuum was filled with despair. The shame of unemployment turned into the numbness of alcohol. The frustration of the cage exploded into domestic violence. And then came the silence. A society that once had no word for suicide suddenly developed the highest rate in the world. This was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made collapse, a direct, linear consequence of a civilizing mission that saved the body with modern medicine, only to crush the spirit with modern bureaucracy. So 70 years later, how does the balance sheet look? If we view the events of 1953 not as a union of brothers, but as the hostile takeover it effectively was, the audit is stark. For Denmark, the merger was a resounding success. They secured their borders. They cemented their relevance on the world stage, transforming from a minor Baltic state into the indispensable gatekeeper of the Arctic. They secured a monopoly market for their goods and a permanent seat at the NATO table. The anxious owner finally slept soundly, knowing the title deed was locked in the vault. For Greenland, the accounting is far more complex. It would be dishonest to ignore the hardware. The integration brought heated homes, modern surgery, and access to the global world. Infant mortality dropped, life expectancy rose, but the price of admission was the soul of the nation. Greenland lost 2, perhaps 3 generations to the trauma of displacement. They traded their autonomy for amenities. The psychological scars of the Coil Campaign and the humiliation of the birthplace criterion created a debt of pain that no amount of block grants can repay. The lesson of 1953 is a brutal philosophical truth. Modernization without cultural empathy is not progress. It is structural violence. It didn't have to be this way. History whispers of the path not taken. Denmark could have chosen a partnership instead of a takeover. They could have built a loose federation that respected the microeconomics of the hunter, rather than forcing the industrial logic of the factory worker upon them. They could have offered support without demanding submission, but in the frozen paranoia of the Cold War, there was no room for nuance. Fear dictated policy. In the eyes of the Danish state, humanity was a luxury they could not afford. They prioritized the security of the map over the dignity of the territory. Denmark bought its safety, but it paid with the identity of the Inuit. And that is a transaction that history will never accredit as fair.
Ultimately, the ledger of 1953 reveals a cold and brutal truth. Denmark secured its geopolitical survival and a permanent seat at the NATO table, effectively purchasing its safety in a dangerous world. Yet the bill was paid by the Inuit, who were forced to exchange their autonomy for amenities and their cultural soul for concrete walls. It stands as a stark reminder that modernization devoid of empathy is not progress. It is simply erasure. So we turn the question to you. Was this integration a necessary sacrifice for survival in the Cold War? Or was it an unforgivable theft of a nation's future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.